Welcome to the Future of Sharing, the series where we're trying to explore the future of the sharing economy, the platform economy, and we're doing this in partnership with Airbnb. I'm Pete Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, the media company that's driving the conversation, and today we've got Carl Pope here. Now, Carl is a veteran environmental leader for many years. He was the former executive director and also later the chairman of the Sierra Club, and he is the co-author of the new book this year, Climate of Hope, which he did with Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York. It's Climate of Hope, How Cities, Businesses, and Citizens Can Save the Planet, something that we've been exploring here as well. Hey, good.
Great to be with you, Pete.
So if you had to just give people, just to open up here a little bit, a sense of the book, what's your kind of short version of what are you trying to do in this book here?
Well, the book is basically about the reality that climate change is a symptom, not a problem of its own. It's a symptom of a series of market failures, each one of which we know how to solve, and each one of which actually we can solve in ways that make us wealthier, healthier, and safer. So our perspective, the reason Mike and I wrote the book, was everybody continued to talk about climate change as this super wicked, massive, overwhelming, existentially impossible to solve thing that was going to destroy us. Mm-hmm. When we looked at it, we said, oh, here's a place where if we actually replaced coal with wind and sun, our electricity bills would go on, electricity would be more reliable, our economies would grow faster. Great. Well, why don't we do that? Mm-hmm. Even if there is no climate problem. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We ought to replace dirty electricity with clean electricity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or look at transportation. Mm-hmm. I actually used to drive a Mini Cooper, which is a well-engineered internal combustion engine car by BMW. I now drive an i3, which is a well-engineered electric vehicle made by BMW. Mm. Let me tell you, I hate driving the Mini Cooper. The i3 is so much better a car that I just don't like it, and it's cheaper. Mm-hmm. So why wouldn't we want to replace what Elon Musk likes to call the world's biggest kludge, the internal combustion engine, with something that's the future? And if we did so, by the way, we wouldn't care what the Saudis charged for oil. It would just be an irrelevancy to us. I don't know what the price of molybdenum was this morning. Maybe some molybdenum producing company is ripping us off for the molybdenum in my stainless steel, but I don't really care about it. It's not like the price of oil, and we could get off oil. So we identified a series of 5 or 6 key market failures that were causing us to do things that were basically bad for us now and worse for us tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And we said, well, since it's bad for us now, why don't we stop doing it?
So you kind of inverted a lot of the doomsdaying, hand-wringing, and kind of flipped them up as opportunities as opposed to challenges.
This is a series of opportunities. Now, if we don't grab them, we'll be in a world of hurt. Let's be clear. It's not that climate change is not unchecked an existential threat. I mean, you just look at the fires that are happening in Southern California, and you say, okay, that's what the future is going to have more of. We already can't cope with the amount of it we've got. So we do need to do some things. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is not about lack of urgency, mm-hmm. but it's one kind of urgency when there's money on the table. And there's another kind of urgency when somebody's finished with a tax bill. And we're saying climate is more like money on the table. Who's going to get it? Rather than like a tax bill, who's going to pay for it?
It's really fascinating. Now, one of the best examples of that, because I also track you in your newsletter, I've been quite impressed by your analysis of the shift from coal to cleaner energies, let's put that. But it kind of is an example of this thing you're saying here. The cleaner was just better, cheaper, why not do it? I mean, but also it takes an industry that was so, I mean, even in this last presidential election, we're still talking about, saving coal. But could you just give a little kind of high, kind of top tier kind of explanation of what happened from a dominant energy source that was screwing up the planet to this collapse essentially in many respects of its value, and
Well-
and we're still entangled, but it's an interesting story of kind of along these lines. What do you think?
Well, I think so. I think we've made the most progress in terms of moving beyond coal. And coal was always a dangerous, dirty, coal always killed. I mean, coal miners died, people in cities died. Coal always corrupted. If you look at the politics of the coal fields, it was always violent, and it was always dirty, and it was always, money was always being, and it cost. I mean, it was always a big underlying threat to the American economy. But the moment the coal fields shut down, the whole economy would shut down. So coal was always a bad deal, but we didn't have a better deal in the 19th century. And we didn't have a better deal for most of the 20th century. So we used it because we were kind of stuck. Then actually starting in the 1960s, we started sending things up into space. They could not send coal with them. So we invented solar panels. And about the same time, people in Europe began to realize that windmills had actually been a pretty good thing. They'd just never been properly harnessed for electricity. We used them as mechanical devices to turn pumps mechanically. And it was more efficient to use the wind to produce electricity. So we began to get wind turbines. Although the first wind turbine was actually invested by NASA. Both of these technologies were made in America. The NASA lab that invented the first wind turbine was on the shores of Lake Erie in Sandusky, Ohio. And so in 1980, after the Arab oil embargo, when President Carter decided to start getting us off of fossil fuels, we began to invest in solar power. Carter put solar panels on the White House back in 1980. Ronald Reagan then came in and said, none of this new stuff. I like the old stuff. So he took the solar panels off the White House roof. He shut down the labs that were doing the research, and we lost about 15 years. But as the world began to become more concerned about climate change, engineers began doing their thing, and when engineers do their thing, stuff gets better. So wind turbines got better. And we invented most of the technology here in the United States, but we didn't deploy it. It was mainly deployed in Europe. And then after the Europeans had deployed a lot of wind turbines and a lot of solar panels, the Chinese looked at the landscape and they said, you know something, that's the next big industry. We want to own it. So the Chinese began investing very heavily, building up huge markets for solar panels in China. And about the time that Barack Obama became president, the question was called, was the United States going to be the leader? And even with President Obama in the White House, the conservatives in Congress and the fossil fuel interests did not want to see coal replaced with cleaner energy. So they blocked initiatives that could have kept America in the global lead. China took the market. China owns the market. China will own the market for the next 50 years. Solar panels as an opportunity for American manufacturing are gone, because in the first couple of years of the Obama administration, when the administration tried to really move solar and wind forward, Congress kneecapped us. Now we're facing the same situation with regard to electric cars. We have the world's greatest electric car company here in the United States, Tesla. I mean, it's by far the biggest electric car play in the world. And the new technology is being developed here in the United States at the moment, except Congress hasn't been willing, and the states have mostly not been willing, California is an exception, to really create the starter market. One of the things that happened for wind and solar was the Europeans created the starter markup, the nursery where the technology can get to scale and work out all the kinks and become cheaper. That's why it's cheaper now. So we haven't created a starter nursery in the United States of sufficient scale for electric vehicles. The Chinese have. And as a result, William Clay Ford, the head of the Ford Motor Company, who's been talking about electric cars for decades, commented quite recently that actually it was clear China was going to drive the electric car market, not the United States. We keep giving away our economic opportunities. And that's because the technologies of the past are owned by powerful politically connected companies like oil and coal, and they don't want to let go of their monopoly in the market. They're going to have to, but they're going to slow the United States down just enough that we don't make most of the profits. Somebody else is going to make most of the profits.
Okay, so there's interesting point there, but overlaying that, we went in a relatively short time. So there's those dynamics going on that's definitely holding the U.S. back. But meanwhile, the world's going on and things are happening here. But we literally watched within the space of a very short time pretty much the collapse of value in the coal industry. If I understand it right, part of that was shifting to natural gas, but also the emergence now of clean energy. Can you just describe what happened there and why it was so quick, and whether this kind of prefaces what might happen to carbon energies like oil, in fact?
Let's be clear. The United States, 5 years ago, coal provided 50% of our electricity. In 2015, it provided less than 30% of our electricity. It's going away. It's going away because it's cheaper, and it's going away because it's cleaner.
It meaning?
Wind and solar are cheaper and cleaner. Yeah. So cheaper and cleaner wind and solar are replacing dirtier, more expensive coal. And if you want to know the dimensions of this, the CEO of CSX, which is a coal hauling railroad, 47% of CSX's revenue miles come from hauling one commodity, coal. And the CEO of that railroad has announced that he is not making any more capital investments in his coal business. If a coal hauling freight car breaks down, it will not be replaced, because he knows coal is going away so fast that he won't be able to amortize. So you can watch the coal supply chain drying up. General Electric globally just laid off 12,000 workers in their fossil fuel electricity division because fossil fuel electricity, coal and natural gas, are going away. They're being replaced by wind and solar. So General Electric is gradually getting out of the business, which was one of its three main businesses. This is happening because the Chinese did scale solar panels, and the Europeans did scale wind. And the Indians are coming along breathing down their necks for both wind and solar. And now you have all over the globe. You have it in Morocco, you have it in Mexico, you have it in Abu Dhabi, you have it in Chile. You have people coming forward to build power plants that either use wind or solar that sell electricity for less than 3 cents a kilowatt hour. This is the cheapest electricity the world has ever enjoyed. And it's just going to wipe out anything more expensive. So same thing's going to happen with electric cars. Electric cars are cheaper. They're not cheaper yet, but they're going to be cheaper. And they're already better than internal combustion cars. And they're going to sweep the market. And factories that make, engine blocks better be making something else. We need to start making the transition to converting those factories from making engine blocks to having them make power electronics or batteries. And we're not doing that. So it's not that we're not going to go from high carbon to low carbon. We are. But we're going to go from American high carbon to imported low carbon, unless we're very careful. And that's what Donald Trump stands for, interestingly. He's slowing down the American economy just enough that we're not competitive. It's a peculiar way to make America great again.
I can definitely see. Okay, so there's a structural thing in clean energy. Now, this series, is trying to probe the sharing economy, themes around, in terms of climate and sustainability. We're trying to figure out, are there ways how do we do more with underutilized assets like cars that sit in your driveway all the time, or rooms that are just empty, or homes that are second homes that are sitting around? Is there a way to reorganize around these in a way that would make a difference in the larger climate sustainability thing? We're also looking at all kinds of new technologies that would make that better. So anyhow, there's a theme that kind of we've been exploring, not to the exclusion of these other contextual things that are obviously interesting to keep here. But one thing, so in your book, you start your book kind of looking at the situation. And there are some aspects of the situation here that we've been trying to wrestle with. So for example, there's a talk about if you can make travel cheaper and easier and drive down the prices of travel, is that going to stimulate more global travel? And if so, are planes essentially going to add more to climate kind of carbon dioxide, and that counteracts the kind of sharing of homes and different things in different parts of the world? I mean, do you know, I don't know to what extent you have all the numbers here, but to what extent are planes, more travel, the global middle class moving around the planet, to what extent is that kind of exacerbating the stresses on the environment and actually losing us ground essentially on bringing in CO2?
Well, more aviation is not going to be a good thing. So, and there's probably going to be more aviation. But when you look at aviation is still a small part of the problem. It's maybe 4 or 5% of the problem. And if it grows, but it grows efficiently, but I'll give you an example with aviation. It turns out traveling from San Francisco to Milwaukee it depends greatly how you do it, which airline you take, which route you take. 50% of the jet fuel that's burned on an average trip is taking off and landing. So direct flights are about twice as good as hub and spoke. So if we actually could set up a world in which everybody could get where they were going with a direct flight in an efficient plane, then we can have more aviation without having more pollution.
Interesting.
But aviation's sort of the hard case because it's hard. Although they're now beginning to play around with electrifying short-distance aviation. Long-distance aviation probably never going to be electrified because you can't carry the fuel long enough distances. But short-haul aviation could easily be electrified and probably will be, and that's where a lot of the pollution is. So here again, doing things efficiently enables us to do more of them without screwing ourselves. But where the real opportunities lie are in things like, okay, let's look at cars. Average car sits idle 95% of the time. That means it lasts 12, 13 years, which means that as technology gets better, it takes 13 years for the automobile fleet to turn over. And if you look at our cities, with the exception of Manhattan, downtown Boston, and downtown San Francisco, virtually every square acre of urban America devotes more space to sleeping cars than it does to sleeping people. So if we move to autonomous vehicles, and if those autonomous vehicles, some of them are used for single passenger trips, but many of them can be used for carpooling trips, the way Lyft and Uber are beginning to do, then all of a sudden, all that space in the central business district, it's about a third of an average central business district in the United States is devoted to parking. That's all freed up. That's suddenly free land that can be turned into more businesses and more residences and more shops. And that means that people can live much closer to downtown. And when they move much closer to downtown, they may take as many trips, but the average trip is not as long. And we're going to see a huge urban renaissance. But the key to that is making sure that as that happens, we don't have, if you end up owning your own autonomous car and I end up owning 2 autonomous cars, we're going to lose all the benefits. The benefits come from sharing an autonomous car so that when I'm just going to the airport, I can get in a car with 2 other people who are going to the airport When I'm taking 6 people out for a party in a limousine, I want a limousine. Well, I don't have to have both a limousine and a little airport car in my garage. I just call one up, it shows up. That's going to be a world in which we're going to have dramatically faster turnover of the automotive fleet, faster technological progress. It'll electrify because that's hugely advantageous once you're driving 100, 150,000 miles a year. You're going to use an electric car. Electric cars last a lot longer, so we won't be wasting as much material manufacturing them, and there'll be no gasoline being used at all. So orchestrating a genuine sharing economy is going to be enormously beneficial. Now, if it's sort of it's not really a sharing economy. Right now, most Uber and Lyft vehicles, they're not really sharing. They're really just a different form of taxi service. And they're better than driving your own car. But they are competing with mass transit, and so that is actually having some negative effects. But long term, if we do it right, the opportunity is enormous. And I'll give you another example. Look at the electricity system. It was constructed where you would have these big, huge, enormous power plants, hundreds of miles away, and then they would ship electricity in wires, and they would ship them to district hubs, and then they would send them to substations, and they would send them from the substations to your transformer, and from your transformer into your house. And they had to have enough electricity so that if everybody in San Francisco turned on their TV and their refrigerator at the same moment, there'd be enough power. I mean, it was a very clunky system. And when you had a windstorm, when they had the windstorms in Southern California, they actually had to shut down power lines because if they'd left them up and they had been knocked down by a tree, they'd have started a fire. What we're moving towards is a world in which we will have neighborhood microgrids. Your neighborhood will share its electricity generating. That's a new form of the sharing economy, where you'll be sharing electricity generation. You'll have solar panels on your roof, and the school in the neighborhood may have a big battery pack to store that electricity. And you and the neighborhood school and you will all be sharing. And you will have set things up so that your car, when it comes home, will draw to charge its battery when your neighbor is out on his night shift, and when he comes back, he'll draw from your car. So we're going to start being interconnected in all kinds of new ways. And that will be a new form of the sharing economy that will greatly accelerate the move away from these 20th century technologies that were dependent on enormous waste of natural resources and enormous pollution.
It's fascinating. It's been on in a bunch of ways I did want to explore. Okay, so here's another piece that's emerged. The role of concrete and construction and new construction. Our understanding is that that has quite an effect on CO2 and things, and that in fact, so the idea of reusing buildings we have or reusing the infrastructure we've already built, there's some reasons for that. I mean, just what's your perspective on that, or can you help us understand that kind of piece? I mean,
well, that's a very important point.
Okay.
And let me take you back historically.
Okay.
During the era of the Greek and Roman civilization, say 500 BC to maybe 500 AD, an enormous amount of construction was done with marble and limestone. Marble and limestone were the dominant high-end building materials of that era. But the only reason that was possible was because the marble and limestone were used over and over and over again. Most late Roman buildings were recycled Greek buildings, where and if you go and look at them, anthropologists have to say, oh, well, this is from the temple of Zeus 100 miles away, built 300 years before this Roman arena was built. So they really understood, because this was a limited resource, and it was a lot of work to chop a piece of marble up by hand. So they reused them. The Romans also invented cement. And the Colosseum was built with Roman cement, and there's still seawalls on the walls of shores of Italy that were built in the Roman era. There's still functioning seawalls because Roman cement was very high quality. But it didn't use very much limestone. So its climate footprint was much smaller than modern concrete. But now we are finding ways. There's a company down in San Jose that makes concrete, which uses far less cement. Cement is the part of concrete that actually creates climate problems.
Could you just explain that piece of it?
Okay. Well,
and how much of an impact it might have too.
Well, about 8% of the total climate problem is making cement, Portland cement, which is made by taking limestone and heating it up and driving off the carbon in it and in making CO2. Then you grind it up, you add water, and it sucks that carbon back in, and that's what causes it to harden.
But there's some excess or something that...
Yeah. Well, you don't. Well, eventually, over 1,000 years, it'll actually absorb back all the carbon it put off. It's over 1,000 years, so it's not helpful. Okay. But we don't build things out of cement. We build things out of concrete, and concrete is a mixture of cement, sand, gravel, volcanic ash. The Romans used a lot of. We can use clinker from steel mills, and there are now ways to use much less cement to make a ton of concrete, which reduces the impact. But the other thing we need to learn how to do is we take 200-year concrete that's good for 200 years, and we build a 20-year building with it. And we don't build it in a way that we can reuse it. We don't make Lego blocks out of concrete. We should make Lego blocks out of concrete. We should develop technologies that enable us to build a building. It'll be there for 20 years or 30 years. And then when it's finished, we'll take it apart and we'll be able to use the Lego blocks all over again. And that's a pure technological problem. And right now there's no strong economic incentive because concrete is cheap. Concrete, incidentally, if you say, what material do human beings use the most of? The material we use the most of is water, of course. And the material we use the second most of is concrete.
Really?
We use more concrete than we use food. We use more concrete than we use fuel. We use more concrete than we use steel. It's the second most used material by human society.
And in your calculations, it accounts for up to 8%?
8%
of what is the global...
Of the global climate footprint, yep.
So if we did rework that, that's a significant piece.
Right, and that's a market failure because right now there's no, the climate impact of the cement that goes into the concrete is not counted. It's not charged for. If you don't build people, if you don't pay your bills, you don't worry about how much you waste. So we waste an enormous amount of cement in constructing our built environment. In some cases, we should actually build our built environment with wood instead of cement, and we would if we had the proper pricing, but we don't.
Market failure. Okay, well so that's an interesting piece there, and these are all interesting pieces, and they're pieces that we've been wrestling with, and you're helping really crystallize it and clarify it. Now the second half of your book, you kind of break these areas into different, green living and various different areas. But one of the things you talk about is cool capitalism. And as one of the kind of, these are all kind of solution areas that we can kind of talk about. So what do you mean by cool capitalism, and what's the kind of, what are you trying to drive there that would kind of aim towards that solution?
Well, as I've mentioned, what Mike and I concluded in writing Climate of Hope was this is a series of market failures. And one of the biggest market failures is within financial markets. And in financial markets, investors choose to do things that make the most sense based on the information they have access to. And in today's financial markets, companies are allowed to hide the risk to their operations from things like climate change. Companies don't have to disclose. For example, the single most important thing that should guide an investor in investing in an oil company. Let's say you want to invest in an oil company. Not a very smart thing to do these days, but let's say you do. The most important thing you want to know is, how is that oil, not how is that oil company going to do when oil is $100 a barrel, all oil companies make money when oil is $100 a barrel. What you want to know is which oil companies can still be making money when oil is $40 a barrel. That fact is completely hidden from you. Oil companies do not have to tell you what the cost of the new reserves they're adding is. They don't have to tell you, oh, this field that we just invested $2.5 billion of shareholder money in is only profitable when oil is $80 a barrel, whereas a competitor may have a field that's competitive at $40 a barrel. So the failure to require disclosure means that investors get ripped off by insiders. And incidentally, when the new age populists, whether they're right-wing populists or left-wing populists, talk about rigging the economy, they're really talking about information asymmetry. The way the economy is rigged by insiders is insiders have information, consumers and investors don't. So cool capitalism is mostly about disclosure.
Transparency, disclosure.
And transparency and disclosure. And if that happened, you would rapidly see, I mean, it was just interesting. When General Motors laid off 12,000 workers in its fossil fuel power division, it's an eighth of its workforce in that whole division, Moody's said, oh my God, we may have been completely wrong in how we've been valuing General Motors and rating its debt. We are now going to have a 2-year investigation to find out how much of a risk General Motors is at from the predictable extinction of fossil fuel electricity. So Moody's has been rating General Electric without knowing whether General Electric was at risk from the largest market change happening in the electrical market today. They just didn't. They said, oh, whoops. Well, got to think about that. Mm-hmm. And that's, the market is operating blind. Mm-hmm. And markets do not operate well when they operate blind.
Hmm. So you're not even calling for, carbon taxes and pricing of carbon or externalities. You're just saying if we just knew the facts, investors right now could make their own judgments on what's a good and bad investment, and we'd shift the economy.
Let's be clear. Mike Bloomberg and I think carbon pricing would be a good thing.
Yeah.
We think carbon taxes would be a hell of a good way to fund the government, much better than income taxes or payroll taxes. We'd rather tax bad things, pollution, rather than taxing good things, work. We don't think we should tax work, we should tax pollution. But without a single carbon price, let me give you an example. If you were a pension fund, and there were many pension funds, and 6 years ago, Peabody Coal put itself on the road with a road show that was aimed at investors, because at that point, India was importing a lot of Australian coal, and China was importing a lot of Australian coal. And so Peabody was making a lot of money because coal that was shipped globally was well priced. So Peabody put this road show out, and they said, oh, here's all the data that shows how much more we're going to be worth. And so lots and lots of pension funds and universities and private investors invested in the coal supply chain. And those who did lost 95% of their money in 5 years in an economic boom. There has never been an industry collapse in a boom to equal the industry collapse of the coal industry. More than 90% of its value. Almost all the companies have been through bankruptcy at least once, and a number of them have been through bankruptcy twice. And you say, wait a minute, these people just went bankrupt. Why would you invest in them again? Because they have all the information and they know how to present that information in a way that makes it look to you like they're a good investment. Because they just make assumptions about, they don't say, oh, let's suppose the price of solar panels kept going down at the rate it's been going down for the last 10 years. Let's just assume that the next 10 years looks like the last 10 years. That's such a radical assumption. If you look at that, none of these coal stocks are worth a penny. They're all stranded assets. And everybody who invests in them will lose everything. But the markets don't provide that kind of information.
Well, now you've laid out the coal collapse. But why wouldn't, with this similar lens and a little bit longer, I mean, why wouldn't the whole oil industry face a similar buckling?
It does. It does. The oil industry is, I mean, right now, the world has about 50 million barrels a day of $30 oil. The world is using about 100 million barrels a day, so oil is 55. But if we stopped using 7, 8, 9 million barrels of oil, we don't have to stop using all of it. We just stop using 7, 8, 9 million barrels a day of oil. And the price of oil will fall below $40. And then the people who own all that $30 oil will start pumping it fast. The Saudis will start pumping it fast because they'll see the market for oil is going away. We've got to get our oil into the market before it all goes away. And that's going to happen. I mean, that is absolutely predictably going to happen. Because Elon Musk may not be able, in 2 years, to replace the hardest part of transportation to electrify, which is long-distance freight. It might take him 5 years, or it might take somebody else 5 years. It's going to happen. And once it happens, there's no market for diesel. It just goes away. And the moment it starts to go away, not when it finishes going away, everybody loses, investors lose their money when the market turns, not when the market ends. We're still using a lot of coal in the United States, and coal stocks are worth nothing. So the investors lose first. They lose at the front edge. Investment values, stock share prices are a leading indicator of market collapse. They're not a trailing indicator. They don't drop at the end of the collapse. They drop at the beginning.
And where do you think we'll see that in, just if you had to guess, in the oil industry?
2026 is when it will really hit, because suddenly it will become clear that although the countries that are saying they're going to ban internal combustion engines by 2030, India has said we're banning internal combustion engines. Britain has said they're banning internal combustion engines. China has said effectively they largely expect to be at about by 2030. Sometime around about 2025, the demand for oil will have dropped sufficiently that the Saudis will pump all out. And when the Saudis pump all out, it's game over for everybody who's invested in the oil supply chain. Everybody who has capital tied up there is going to lose everything.
But why wouldn't someone just see that writing on the wall?
Oh.
Why wouldn't it start buckling right now?
Well, it may, again, it may well. And if we had transparency in the market, if oil companies, what would happen if oil companies had to disclose? Right now, the stock market values oil stocks based on reserves. They don't value oil stocks based on margins because they don't disclose margins. You can't value something you don't know. If oil companies had to disclose margins, then what you would see is the Saudi offering of Aramco as an IPO would become an extremely attractive offering. And ExxonMobil, which seems to have the biggest remaining investment in oil that costs more than $100 a barrel to produce, would go like that.
That's fascinating. That's great. So that's a good little, well, all right. So there's a whole cool capital piece. Just looking at the timer, we're going to have to keep moving because there's so many awesome things here. So another piece I just want to bring out on your book is your focus on cities. And I also kind of want to start looking at a little bit on, here we are in San Francisco Bay Area, California as a coherent state. And so talk a little bit about your view on where, and this is something, by the way, in the sharing economy we've been seeing where all the innovations around cities, and everyone's kind of just given up on the federal government at some level. So just give some of your reflections on the city focus and particularly, and we can move a little bit more on the California focus in a minute here. Well, why are you so bullish on the cities, and why do you think that could, and why does that make, as opposed to essentially federal solutions or more centralized
Okay.
solutions?
Well, Mike Bloomberg and I both believe that Mike said in a speech he gave at a college commencement lecture in Istanbul about 4 years ago, he said, the 19th century belonged to empires, the 20th century belonged to nation states, and the 21st century belongs to cities. And I think he's right. And the reason for that is cities globally, and then we'll talk about the American situation, have three big advantages. The first thing is they attract the most innovative human beings. One of the things that is true when somebody moves from the countryside to a city is he or she does not move to do the same thing, they move to change. So when somebody moves to a city, they move to change. So cities are the natural hub of innovation, and they always have been. The second thing cities have is that they don't produce commodities. Very little of the world's coal is mined under cities. Very little of the world's oil is mined under cities. Very little of the world's iron ore is extracted from underneath Fifth Avenue. I mean, there is some natural gas produced from underneath Houston, but that's kind of an exception. And since cities are consumers of commodities, they want to use them efficiently and they want them to be cheap. Cities don't like high prices for steel and oil and gas and coal and wood. So cities are on the side of let's find ways to use less of these materials. And we live in a world where between now and 2050, global GDP is probably going to triple, maybe quintuple. And the amount of natural resources we use is going to be cut in half because we're going to run out. So we have to get between 6 and 10 times as much value out of a pound of stuff, whether the stuff is concrete or steel or oil. So cities are on the right side of that change. And the third thing is that, you know, Washington or Paris or Moscow has a couple of years to solve a problem. I mean, you know, something comes up, oh, we're going to debate a tax bill. And everybody says, well, it should take a year and a half to debate a tax bill. That's the kind of time frame that nation states are on. Mayors have to pick up a snowstorm in 36 minutes. The feedback loops in cities are much closer. The learning curves are much faster. And as a result, cities are much more pragmatic. They're not pragmatic because they're more virtuous. I mean, let's be real. There's nothing particularly about becoming a mayor that makes you a more thoughtful, careful, responsive human being, except there is. If you don't get the snow picked up, you'll be fired. So the feedback loops, the tightness of the feedback loops in cities gives cities this enormous advantage. In the United States, we have an additional issue, which is we have a constitution that designed our federal government to be slow moving. That was intentional. And we now live in a moment when the country needs to move quickly, and the federal government was just hardwired not to be good at this. I mean, it's not accidental that we hate Congress when it's in Democratic hands. We hate Congress when it's in Republican hands. And I actually like politicians. I don't think this is because we elect people who are more jerks than the rest of us. We do elect some jerks, but there's some jerks in the population at large. That's where we get the politicians who are jerks. And they're not all jerks at all. But they've been given an impossible job. They've been told, move at internet speed with James Madison's Constitution. And James Madison's Constitution was designed to move very slowly.
That's a good.
So when you look at climate, I mean, I'll give you an example. If you have, and let's look at California for a second. We have pretty innovative state leadership. We have demonstrated as a state that we can move faster on cleaning up pollution, modernizing the environment, solving climate, and still have the strongest economy in the country, which we do. So California as a state has performed quite well. But even so, when you ask Governor Brown, it's really time that we stop mining so much oil in California. We've got we mine some of the dirtiest oil. The oil that comes out of Kern County is some of the most polluting oil that anybody produces anywhere, and California produces a lot of it. You say, Jerry Brown, it's time to shut that down. Jerry Brown says, no. On the other hand, if you ask the mayor of San Jose, would you like to require all the vehicles that move in San Jose to be electric? He says, on the right timetable, absolutely. Because he's not producing oil. He's consuming it. And he'd rather get rid of it. He'd rather not pay for it. And his businesses would rather not pay for it. And his households would rather not pay for it. So cities just don't have the dead weight of the economy of the past on their backs in the way that states and nations do. And nations have it much more than states. I mean, you know, Washington has to worry about how do they keep Alaska happy. I mean, I assure you, the mayor of Houston is not thinking about Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
With this kind of attraction, everyone moving to cities globally, it's a phenomenon. It's increasing, all we know. It also puts the impetus, and you kind of use some of those numbers there, of just, we have to, it's calling for some kind of radical reorganization of space, of people, of efficiencies. It's kind of like, if we're going to crack this 21st century challenge of climate change, it feels like where all the people are going, or increasingly going, has to be the actual place where we solve this at some level. And there's some kind
well, absolutely. If you look at the numbers, right now, today, 50% of the world's population lives in cities, and 70% of the world's GDP, 70% of the world's climate emissions come from cities, and 80% of the world's GDP comes from cities. Okay? In 15 years, those numbers are all going to be like 100%. I mean, they're really...
In how many years? 50, you said?
15.
15?
I mean, really not 100, they'll be in the 90s, but you're going to actually see less and less economic activity is going to take place outside of metropolitan areas. And that means less and less pollution is going to take place outside of urban areas, because pollution comes from economic activity. If there's no economic activity, I mean, you know, the empty part of Nevada does not emit a lot of carbon. So we're going to see almost all of the profits to solve the problem, the emissions that create the problem, the innovation that generates the solutions, and the political will to move forward is all going to be concentrated in urban areas. And that's irresistible. I mean, one of the things that I think Mike and I would like to say is, we believe in leadership. We think leaders matter. Mike thinks it matters that he was the mayor of New York City. But having said that, when people say, oh, this calls for a radical restructuring, no, no, no. The radical restructuring is happening. Mm-hmm. This calls for an intelligent response. So, for example, we ought to be making sure that as the coal mining, the Museum of American Coal Mining in eastern Kentucky, is no longer gets its electricity from coal. It put solar panels on its roof because the solar panels were cheaper. As that happens to Kentucky and West Virginia, we do not want Kentucky and West Virginia to become Somalia, a failed state within the United States. We need to put programs in place to make sure that West Virginia, for example, has a couple of really interesting economic advantages in the 21st century. It's the coolest part of the Middle Atlantic, and it has cheap real estate. A lot of it used to be coal mines, but that's flat, cheap real estate. Mm-hmm. And West Virginia is thus now becoming a major center for data centers, because the biggest cost of a data center is cooling it. So you don't want to put data centers in places where it's 100 degrees in the summer like Washington, D.C. The data centers that serve Washington, D.C. are a couple thousand feet up in West Virginia, because it's cool. Now, that won't really create a new economy for West Virginia. Mm-hmm. But if you have all the data centers there already, if you invested in better roads and better broadband, then all of a sudden West Virginia could become a major technology hub. Mm-hmm. And the children of coal miners were going to need to give pensions to. They're all 55 anyway, so, you know, that's reasonable. But the children of coal miners should be able to work in West Virginia if we would invest in a future for West Virginia. But in spite of the fact that Donald Trump is very loud in his praise of coal miners, and in spite of the fact that Mitch McConnell represents the great state of Commonwealth of Kentucky, neither of them is doing anything to help Kentucky and West Virginia compete in the 21st century. In fact, Trump is defunding programs that were set up to help West Virginia and Kentucky compete in the 21st century. The coal's going to go away. Oil's going to go away. Vehicles going to be electrified. All these things are going to happen. But whether Americans are going to prosper as a result is up to leadership. And right now, there ain't much.
With that in mind, clear signal and shared by many people what's going on with Trump and the Republicans in Washington. But go back to California a little bit here. I understand your constraints. You know, yes, it is still dealing in some ways with oil or something. I mean, so by no means perfect. But do you feel that there's an opportunity for California, relatively coherent place with the resources it has and all kinds of things, now pretty much super majorities of progressives and others? Do you think it could be a kind of a laboratory or a model for the rest of the country or even for other parts of the world as a coherent, you know, sixth largest economy, kind of 40 million person kind of entity? Or what do you think about that?
Well, California has demonstrated clearly and unequivocally that innovation pays. Why we needed a demonstration of this is not clear to me. It seems somewhat self-evident, but we've demonstrated it. That the jury's no longer out on that. The president doesn't seem to understand it, but he doesn't understand many things. California's also demonstrated that having high standards, because in many parts of the regulatory structure we do have high standards. We have good pollution laws. We have much better labor rules than most states. We have higher minimum wages. So California's demonstrated a whole bunch of things that everybody said were job killers or job creators. And there was a very interesting article about a year ago that demonstrated that, in fact, by any measurement, corporations that are headquartered in California make more money than corporations that are headquartered anywhere else in the world.
In the world?
Yeah. So we've demonstrated that our model works. What we have not yet done is to apply our model broadly. We have not applied our model to say, okay, San Jose, doing rather well. Santa Clara is doing rather well. West Los Angeles is doing rather well. What about Modesto? We haven't managed to make California as a whole thriving. Coastal California is thriving. Inland California is still in a world of hurt. And the legislature has not figured out, and part of the problem is that the political representatives of Inland California are not pushing hard for innovation. They're actually representing the past. But what we need to do is to say, okay, let's take pensions. People used to get pensions from their employer. That's not going to happen anymore. They're not going to get real pensions from their employer. And Social Security is never going to be big enough to actually provide you with a decent retirement. So California did pass, the legislature passed a bill a couple years ago, which allowed the creation of a state-funded pension pool into which you could contribute. Mm-hmm. And it would not have all of the cost burdens of doing a 401k. Congress then has tried to take that away. And there's been really no big public pushback. The state is not really, that was a great innovation. And the state has not owned that innovation. It's a way of sharing your pension plan. And if we're talking about the sharing economy, it's a way of sharing pension burdens. It's a way of sharing healthcare burdens. So California could become exactly that model. But California has to take the economic crisis in Eastern California much more seriously than it's doing at the moment. Too much of the intellectual bandwidth is on the parts of the state that are doing well and too little is being devoted to parts of the state that are still struggling.
Interesting. One thing before we kind of gotta wrap up here, but totally get that, and I like that heartland kind of side. But the other side here, given that you kind of come out of the environmental movement, is with the move to the cities, we're seeing this incredible housing problem and affordable housing crunch and all this stuff. And I'm wondering if you can, since you see the innovation forward motion, how do we do the future? But you also understand the legacy of, you know, hey, I don't want anything blocking my view, and let's keep the green space, and let's not develop, and environmental slowdowns and checks and all that stuff. Where do you sit now when you kind of think that, you know, how our cities got to reorganize around housing and all the things that essentially...
Well, let me give you a very concrete example. I mean, a very concrete example. I suspect that in the Bay Area, people who live in this broad Bay Area spend about $1 billion a year flying to Europe to enjoy 6-story cities. Paris, London, Madrid, Rome, Barcelona, Vienna, they're all 6-story cities. Most of San Francisco is zoned as a 1.5-story city. Now we passed something this spring that's going to open that up a little bit. But we need to understand that, especially, this is where the autonomous vehicle becomes important, the shared autonomous vehicle. Once you have shared autonomous vehicles, you don't need all that space for parking. And you can, I'm not really a fan of high-rise, but I'm a big fan of 4 to 6 story. Cities should be 4 to 6 stories. And then you can actually have real vibrant urban life and cafes and little neighborhood music clubs. You don't have to go downtown to do everything. So we need to embrace the 4 to 6 story, low parking, low traffic, and lots of green space. You can have, I mean, Barcelona, every block has a park in it. Mm-hmm. You can have a park in every block and still have 4 to 6 story cities. So we need to embrace that kind of density. I'm not personally very fond of high-rise, but if I was 28 and hip, I might be. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But not anymore. That was then. Now it's now.
And the green belts, we could preserve those green belts without having to do infills in any kind of ways that are really...
Well, if you consider the figure that 30% of the inner core of our metropolitan areas is devoted to parking, and that 30% is going to be freed up in the next 15 years by autonomous vehicles, then you actually are going to have a problem. You're going to have you're going to have not the Detroit problem, which was a hollowed out urban core. You're going to have a hollowed out outer ring. You're going to have the inner suburbs, which were really always made up of businesses and families that wanted to be close, but couldn't get there because it was expensive. Those inner suburbs, that inner ring is going to it's going to empty out. We can create new green belts.
That's an interesting thing. Well, that's actually, we have to kind of wrap here, but clearly you've been throwing a very hopeful frame on what is often a gloomy kind of topic here. And so as we kind of end here, do you think we have it in us here to kind of turn the corner on all these big challenges, to kind of build this kind of infrastructure in new ways and actually get ahead of the rise of the planet's temperature here in a way that we can kind of pull this off? In a way, I'm just curious, we're kind of leaving us here of like, is this doable and we're going on track to do it?
I mean, I spent my whole life as a working environmentalist trying to clean up the industrial economy of the 20th century. And cleaning up the industrial economy of the 20th century meant going to people, whether they were businesses or government officials or public constituencies, and saying, you know something, we've made a mess. Our grandkids are really going to want us to clean up the mess. And yes, it's going to cost something to clean up the mess, but we ought to do it. That was kind of a hard sell. Now, I'm in a very different moment. We're not cleaning up that economy. We're creating a new economy. And the new economy is going to be very profitable. And it's going to be much cleaner. Anything new we build is going to be much cleaner than what we built 30 years ago. So my message now is, you're missing the boat. The future is coming, and you're not catching the wave. That turns out to be an easier sell. And if this was the only big problem we had, I could really home. Unfortunately, we have a lot of other problems which are not so easy to solve, where we don't have a big technological tailwind pushing us forward. And as we fail to solve those other problems, I mean, look at Syria. Yes, the climate crisis helped trigger what happened in Syria, but what's happened in Syria has made solving a manageable agricultural problem in Syria into an unmanageable human catastrophe. So I can't say I'm a huge optimist, because while my little piece of the puzzle is looking much more positive than it used to, there's a much larger world out there where things are challenging and where leadership is lacking.
Unrelated to the climate change.
Unrelated to climate change. I'm now working on one of the world's easier problems. I spent my life working on what I thought were hard problems. Now I'm working on one of the world's easier problems.
That's an interesting way. So if we had this conversation in about 25 more years, I don't know if the two of us will be here, but let's say we were, do you feel we can hit this kind of 2050-ish, 2030, 2050 kind of turn the corner on climate change, though, aside from all these other challenges we have? Do you feel that's now within sight, understandable, we can do it?
Yeah, now, you know, there will be some bad impacts from the mess we've already made. We will have some horrific hurricanes and some horrendous droughts, and we will lose some species, and some agricultural communities will be disrupted, and there will be hundreds of thousands of climate refugees. That's all baked. But if that's all that happens from climate, the money we will make from transitioning from the old economy to the new economy will amply pay the costs. We just have to make sure that as we make money from progress, we use some of that money. It doesn't have to be a big slice. A little slice of what we make from innovation, we have to put into paying for the legacy of the past. We've got a bill that's going to come due. And it'll be very easy to pay for if we innovate. And it will not be easy to pay for if we stand still, as the man in the White House would seem to want us to do.
That's a good place to stop, and I appreciate you coming by. And
this was fun.
Thanks so much for the conversation.
This was fun.